Airtable automations are great, but they're not always enough. Sometimes you need a more advanced or more robust automation than what Airtable can handle natively, especially if you're integrating to external tools like Stripe, QuickBooks, etc. In this video, we're going to be showing you how to take an Airtable system and connect it to Stripe using Make. Airtable will be our source of record, while Stripe will handle the actual invoice itself. So Make will sit in the middle, moving the data between the two. If you've never built an automation from scratch before, don't worry, because we're going to be using Claude with the MCP to inspect our Airtable schema and then prompt Claude to build the entire Make scenario for us. If you're ready to learn how to supercharge your Airtable base with a Make scenario like this, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth and this is Gap Consulting. It's our mission here to help you unlock the full potential of no-code tools, and Airtable and Make are at the forefront of that mission. Now, as I've demoed in the intro here, we're going to be creating a system that automatically sends emails through our Stripe account. This will be using a couple of different tools to tie everything together. Airtable is going to be our source of record, our place where all the information lives. But then we're going to connect it to the other tools that run the business. And for our example, we're going to showcase Stripe, which is an invoicing and transaction payment platform. Now, before I jump into the heart of the video, I do want to first invite you to join me for some automation training. If you've never built an automation before and you need to understand the foundation of automation so that you can step away from the repetitive work in your job or your business, grab that training at gapconsulting.io/webinar-registration. We've helped thousands of clients build better automations so that they can focus on the important things in their business rather than the repetitive, mundane copy and paste of information. So if you're ready to join those ranks, the best place is to start with that training. I will include links wherever you found this video. But now let's jump into it. What are we starting with? So number one, Airtable is our source of record, as I've said. This is where all the information lives, but the other pieces of our business, of our organization, they are touching many, many different tools. And so in the case where we are sending out invoices from Stripe, you might think, well, why not just build an automation in Airtable? Doesn't Airtable have its own automations? Now, I want to be crystal clear that I do not want to come across as being anti-Airtable automation, because nothing could be further from the truth. I use Airtable automations all the time, both in our own internal builds and also in our client deliverables. But Airtable automations don't do everything. They are excellent for keeping Airtable up to date, or for sending simple emails, or connecting with Google Calendar, and just a small number of different native integrations. But if you're looking for a more robust automation, something that really goes above and beyond, you will need to graduate beyond Airtable automations and bring in a supercharging automation tool. And one of my favorites is Make, or Make.com. This tool will allow you to connect with thousands of other applications, other software that's on the cloud, and give you beautiful scenarios that you can really take to the next level with very complicated conditional logic and mapping and all kinds of multiple layers inside of your automation setup for error handling and more robust use cases. If you're not already using Make, you can sign up using our affiliate link. It's a great way for you to get a little bonus and give some love back to the channel. So again, find that link wherever you found this video. But now let's dive into what we are actually dealing with from our example, and we always start by understanding our schema. So let's jump into Airtable at the data layer and look at the tables that we have. I have 3 different tables built. The first one is contacts. It has the name of the person, the company name, their email, the phone number. We're storing the Stripe customer ID if we know it, and maybe adding some billing notes, and we're linking to projects and invoices. Projects is where we store the project level information. So it has the start date, whether the project is active or whatever the status is, who is the client, who is the project owner from our team. and of course links to invoices. And then lastly, and this is the table that matters for our automation, we have the invoice table. We store the invoice ID. It's linked to a project. We have an invoice status. We have an invoice amount, a currency, a description, a due date, an invoice ID. This is what's coming from Stripe. We also have the hosted invoice URL, perhaps the invoice PDF as well. And we have the status here, the Stripe payment status, paid date, last automation run, automation error. These last two are fields that you can add to your Airtable setup when you're using external automation. And we can actually log how the automation is running, timestamp when the last run was, note any errors here in the field, in the text field. But of course, then we're also linking to client. We know the client email and we know the Stripe customer ID. So this is the setup of our database. And what we want to do is create an automation so that when we have filled out the basic information for an invoice and set that invoice to be ready to create, that the automation picks it up, sends it to Stripe, creates the actual invoice, and then comes back to Airtable and updates Airtable where we have the record of information. That way we know what happened in our automation. What is the invoice that we created? Was it sent? What's the status? And all of that. So starting in 2026 and beyond, the best place to start here is in AI. I tend to prefer Claude right now, and so I'm going to be using Claude, and the first step to building the automation is to give Claude full context of our Airtable base. So let's hop on into Claude, and we're going to go step by step. I'm in Cowork, and I'm going to start by making sure that my Airtable connector is turned on, which it is. So from here, I'm going to simply give Claude a prompt and ask it to analyze the Airtable schema. So pretty quickly, Claude was able to go through our Airtable schema and understand exactly what it is we're trying to do here. So I started this whole thing by providing the base ID. I find this is the fastest way to tell Claude exactly which database in Airtable I want it to explore. And Claude came back with the 3 different tables in the database, as well as a list of the fields, the ID of the fields, and the type of data that stays in those different fields. And of course, this is the exact same information that I just walked you through in the previous section of the video where we looked at the Airtable schema and said, these are the tables and these are the different fields. So Claude has done all of this within a matter of moments and then put together a little bit of an understanding. Hey, here are the relationships. This is what's happening in this database. Then Claude also breaks down what is standing out for the make build. So it's just giving us a really high level understanding of things that it found in our database that we might want to flag for our automation. So for example, it calls out that we want to avoid double creating an invoice if a scenario runs concurrently. So these are things we're going to have to think through. And it's even prompted us with a couple of questions, such as the direction and trigger. Is it going to be an Airtable, prompt? Of course, we haven't even prompted Claude yet. So let's push pause on that for now. And then, of course, also the trigger mechanism. This is important because when you're using Make, the watch records trigger, which is what initiates the automation, is polling on a view. And so the better way to send a trigger is through a webhook pushing into Make, which of course we're going to solve for. But now let's talk through with Claude exactly what we want our new automation to do. So in our example, we have Airtable that's going to kick it off. We want to move our Airtable invoice from the draft stage to ready to create. And when we do that, that is basically saying this invoice is no longer a draft. We are ready to send it out to Stripe. So how do we build this process? Well, first, let's actually start with a sample record. So we're going to create a sample invoice. Of course, we're going to assign it to the same project, and we will assign it to the same person. So this is test person, and you'll notice, of course, that I'm using my email address here. It's really helpful when testing automations. If you send them to yourself, make sure that you're doing everything you want. Now, what I really care about here is that we have an amount. So let's set up an amount for this invoice of 1,000 and a currency. And of course, by default, the draft status should be set. So let's actually set up a default status in Airtable so that when we create a new invoice, it always gets the draft status. Now, as I said at the beginning, I always use Airtable automations when it makes sense. And so the beginning of this automation is going to be an Airtable automation. So the first step is to build an Airtable automation under certain conditions. So we want to send information to Make so that it can then pass that information to Stripe, but only under conditions. So those conditions are in our invoices table, we want the status to be ready to create. And we also want to insist that there is a client, because if there is not a client, if the client is empty, then we can't send an invoice to anybody. So we have to say the client must not be empty. And we have to have at least a client email or a client Stripe ID, because if we don't have those things, again, we don't know who to send the invoice to. So let's make sure that we have at least the client email so that this is not empty. And then we will also say that we have to have an amount. There has to be an invoice amount, otherwise we cannot actually create an invoice. So this amount must be greater than 0. The more automations you build over time, the easier this will become. But what we're doing is setting up the conditions that we want to trigger our automation. Now, one more thing is we want to make sure our automation never triggers multiple times. So in order to do that, let's set up a rule that says that the automation run was never. This must be blank or must be empty. If we've performed the automation before, we don't want to do it again. So basically, we will come back and fill out the date time after we've run the automation. So if this has any information in it, it means we already automated and we don't want to do it again. So let's go ahead and find a record. Well, there isn't one. So we have to pop back to Airtable to make sure that we've moved this to ready to create. Now it meets the conditions we're looking for. And if we choose a record, we can find this one. Now, what are we going to do with it? The first thing we need to do is actually update the status away from ready to create and put it into the creating status. That's where we send it to Make. So let's do exactly that. We're going to update this record in Airtable, the one that triggered the automation. And we're still in the Airtable automation, mind you. We're going to update the record that triggered the automation right here. With the new status, we're going to take the invoice status and bump it to creating. And then we're also going to flip into our automation run, and we're going to put information in here about when we last ran the automation. So we'll bring in dynamic information for the specific time that this is running. So let's just generate a preview of, or actually run this as configured so that we can see what this looks like. Run a test, pop back into Airtable in the data layer, and you can see that we've updated the status and we've come in here and put in the last automation run date. Now it's time to send this information to Make, and this is where a webhook is going to come in handy because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to use the polling information from Make. We want to use a webhook. So this part we can build ourselves. Let's head into Make. We're going to create a scenario, and we are going to build a webhook trigger. We can search for webhook here just by spelling it out, and we will get a webhook built-in option right here. We can use the custom webhook, and it's going to give us a new hook if we add a new one. So we can set up the API key authentication if you would like, or just save this, and this webhook URL is basically the phone number that we're going to call from Airtable. We're going to call this webhook, and we're going to share the record ID of our invoice so that we can do everything we need to do. So we're going to copy this webhook URL and move back into Airtable, into our automation. And the last step of this is going to be to run a script. Now, listen, I do not write code. I do not write scripts myself. Don't let this intimidate you. We can easily go to our AI tools to create the script so that we can send the record ID directly to Make. Let's go ahead and bring back Claude and tell it that we're ready for this step. So I've gone ahead and prompted Claude with exactly this. Before we create the Make automation, let's work on the trigger. I've created a Make scenario that triggers from a webhook, and here's the webhook, so I pasted that in. And then I want to send the record ID from the invoice in Airtable using a script automation in Airtable. I already built the Airtable automation, but please produce the script. And so this is the script that Claude has created. So we can take that, copy and paste it back into Airtable. Again, we didn't have to write a single line of code ourselves. Now, what we do need to do is grab this record ID and create this variable, because we are passing in a variable record ID and we are appending the webhook with that record ID. So we can bring it in like this, add the record ID that triggered our automation, and we're bringing that variable in. Let's actually do a test run here, but before we do that, I'm going to go into Make and save this scenario, and I'm going to ask it to run this module. Now it's listening for that webhook. Flip back into Airtable and test this scenario. You're going to see that it runs successfully, assuming that our code was right. And it says sent record ID to Make, status 200, which means it got it. So if we flip back into Make, we're going to see green checkboxes. It received the record ID from the invoice table as we asked it to do. So now this automation triggers instantly. Rather than having to poll Airtable every few minutes and waste a ton of credits in Make, this is the much more efficient way of doing this. Because now our overall Airtable automation is ready when we update the invoice status. It then updates the invoice, and then it runs the script, which sends the information to Make, which is going to trigger the Make automation. One thing I forgot to do here was make sure that we have a due date. So this is really important. Let's bring in a due date. So make sure that the due date is not empty. And let's go back to our data layer as well and make sure that we've updated a due date on the record. We'll put it in for the 22nd of June. Of course, we have to have a due date if we're going to create this invoice. So now we are ready. We can go now to our Make integration, and we've built the webhook. And let's name this. We'll name it invoice to Stripe test example. And I'm going to copy the name of this. And I'm going to flip now into Claude, and I'm going to give Claude the prompt we need to have Claude build this in Airtable. Now I've put together a prompt, and Claude is deep in its work right now. It's already been going for a couple of minutes, but a couple of things that I want to highlight while we allow Claude time to think and deliver. So number one, I've put together my own outcome here that I'm looking for from Claude. So I've told it basically exactly what needs to happen in this automation. And I want to highlight the depth to which I went. Now, you don't have to necessarily know all of this yourself. If you don't already know exactly what you want Claude to build, then prompt with Claude and talk through it, because Claude can access the documentation from Make and Airtable and Stripe, and it can recommend how to build this. Now, I've built this several times, so I kind of know what it's going to look like. So here's what I tell it. Look, we've already got a webhook. The webhook is received from Airtable with the invoice record ID. The next thing you need to do is find the invoice record. You then have to go into Stripe and find the customer object based on the Stripe ID. If you don't already have that, use the email. If you don't have that, then you're going to have to create your own customer. And of course, we're going to update Airtable with that information. But then you need to create the invoice. You need to come back to Airtable and update Airtable. And of course, you also have to update with the customer ID. Now, this is all pretty, part and parcel. But what I really want to call out is that we've added this. Add proper error handling as you deem necessary. This little line, you might have just passed it over, but this is really important because Claude will allow Make to have error handling inside the automation, which builds a better, stronger automation for you, and ultimately means that when it fails, if it fails, you get a quicker answer as to what went wrong. And then the other thing is, I am also calling out number 8. I strongly recommend you do this if you are following along. Always tell Claude to only use current connectors, because I've found in my experience with using Claude MCP with Make that it will very often default to old modules, old, no longer supported legacy modules. And I don't want it to use that. I want current, up-to-date, modern modules in Make. So you'll notice here exactly what happened here with the conversation. It wasn't immediately able to find the scenario. So it did tell me how to find the ID. It's in your URL. But the problem that I had was not saving my scenario. So make sure in Make, if you've already created a part of it and you're asking Claude to update that scenario, make sure that you save it first and then share that information with it. So I shared the info, and here is Claude hard at work. Let's see what the outcome is. Now, Claude has really done a lot of heavy lifting. Let me share with you what the outcome is. So first and foremost, there were some questions. Claude wanted to confirm with us how we wanted to do certain things. In our schema, we had two different invoice fields to take the invoice ID. So it asked me and it gave me a drop down. Which one do you want to use? I made the selection. It also asked how we should be issuing the invoice. Are we going to send it ourselves, or are we going to finalize and send it via Stripe? So I made a choice there. And then lastly, it asked what scenario I wanted to use, what app connection from Airtable. And so I asked it to set up a new connection rather than use an old connection, since this is just an example. So then Claude went into thinking mode and it went to work. And this took a while, many minutes, honestly. But Claude believes that it has now fully set up the scenario. So let's take a look at it. Now, when I first refreshed my page, this is a mess. So something's not quite right in terms of how it is showing up. Let's go into edit mode though on our diagram. Let's back up here and let's save changes, of course, yes. But let's get into the diagram itself and edit the flow of this thing. So we can come down here and just hit this auto align or hold Shift and A, and boom, just like that, you now see our whole scenario has been moved out. So the issue from earlier is that everything was just stacked on top of itself and it just wasn't showing up properly here. But once you auto align it, look at this. I mean, this is a really robust scenario that's been built. We can dial in here and see what's happening. So we're going into Airtable. We're going to look it up based on the Airtable record ID, just like we asked. We're going to try to find that information in Stripe. If no customer is found, we're going to come down here and create the customer and then do all the things. If the customer is found, we're going to come up here and do all the things. So a robust scenario. We're creating the invoice, we're finalizing a draft, we're making the API calls, and we're going back to Airtable and updating all of that information. Now, honestly, if I had done this by hand, this would have taken hours, even if I had a template I was working from and remapping. And so, yes, did it take Claude a while? Sure, 10 minutes or so. But that is a ton of time saved. And if you were paying a consultant like someone on our team, a lot of money saved. So now that this is done, let's go ahead and save it. And let's run the scenario. So it's saved, it's published. I want to see what happens. So we're going to turn this on and say we're going to run it immediately when data arrives. And I'm going to back out here to the top level. And let's go back now to Airtable and send a test record through. So we're going to create a new record here. Let's create a new one for the website redesign project. And it's in draft mode. Let's set it up for a $50 test email or test invoice in USD. We're going to set the due date. And I believe that is all we need. Oh, we need a client. So notice that we still don't have a Stripe customer ID. So we're going to hopefully cross our fingers here and see if the scenario does what it's supposed to and creates that test object for us, the Stripe customer object. So once we have all the information filled out, let's verify it all and then update that invoice status to ready to create. If you remember, that's going to trigger our Airtable automation and it moves it to creating. Let's now see what's happening because that information is getting sent to Make. And you can see that it didn't run quite properly. There was an error on the first test. This happens. Don't get discouraged just because you have an error. Let's figure out what broke down. So how do we resolve some errors in Make? Well, the quickest way is to go back to the source, in our case, Claude, who built the scenario in the first place. And it was pretty simple. I just put in, this is what happened. This is the error I got. We need some help. And so Claude went through all the steps. And it turns out it was the improper level of authorization in our connector to Airtable. So it wasn't in the way that the scenario was actually built. It was the authentication that we used for the build itself. So now we're going to test it again. We can turn this thing on and say, process that old data, and we want to see if you can go through the steps. And again, okay, we're not 100% of the way there, but we are getting closer and closer. So again, we've gone through a certain number of steps and we had an execution failure. Now, what Claude is asking us for is, of course, the information on the actual run failure itself. So I'm going to grab the actual execution run from the URL and share it with Claude. This is exactly how you go through testing these scenarios after they're already built. So I go back to Claude and I type in a prompt basically telling it, this is the particular log that we ran. This is the specific execution, as it's called. And I want you to go in and get the information about why it failed and fix it. So go back in, update the overall scenario entirely. And so that's exactly what Claude is doing for us right now. We're asking it to go in, set everything up. Don't forget to set that up because we can't look at it set up on top of itself like that. But let Claude do all of the heavy lifting for you as you go through troubleshooting. So a couple of more failed tests back and forth with Claude is all it took. And now we are getting a successful output. So let's take a look at what happened. Our scenario now successfully ran. It went through all of the different steps. And if we zoom in here, we'll see that the customer was resolved and it created the invoice item, finalized and sent the invoice, and then went back and updated Airtable. So 2 places for us to check to make sure that everything went according to plan. Number 1, let's pop into our email. And as you can see, I received this invoice from our system in Stripe. So it came from Gap Consulting for $50, which is the amount that we were testing for. This was sent directly to me via Stripe because we opted to send the invoice directly from Stripe after it was created. The other place we need to go back and check is Airtable itself. And as you can see, when I pop back in here, everything is filled out as we would expect. We get that invoice ID. It was updated to the sent status, and we can see the invoice hosted URL as well as the invoice PDF URL. So both of these are really helpful if we need to go back and share this information again with the client. We have the invoice URL all stored in the system, as well as the last automation run. And of course, because we also got a successful output, there is no automation error. Now, lastly, I want to highlight that we now have a customer ID. This customer did not previously exist in Airtable. The customer may have existed in Stripe, but we didn't have that Stripe customer ID stored in Airtable. That has now been updated. So we have that information here. And if we look at Airtable itself, this is the source of record. You can see that the Stripe customer ID was edited by me via my make automation, and that happened 2 minutes ago. So this scenario, this big thing, is now set up to run our invoice creation, and the entire bottom half here is our error handling, making sure that we create that customer, update Airtable accordingly. If we had done this by hand, it would have taken hours, but all of this now available with a few prompts in Claude and let all the heavy lifting happen from AI, and we now have the glue using Make that's going to glue our source of record Airtable to the different tools in our business so that we can work smarter. I hope you got a ton of value from this video, and if you did, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel and let us know how you are starting to implement more automation in your business. If you're ready to build smarter systems in your business, swing by our website and grab our free strategy session where you can talk to a member of our team and schedule directly there to learn how you can start unpacking better systems in your business. Sign up at gapconsulting.io/strategy-call. That's it for this one. We will see you next time, but most importantly, keep on building.